Shalom, family. Welcome to today. This week's Torah portion is Tisa. It's Exodus 30:11 through 34:35, and Kitisa means when you take. And the main events of these chapters include instructions for census and atonement money, artisans filled with God's Spirit, reminder to keep Shabbat, stone tablets, golden calf, Lord's anger, Moses's pleading, tablets broken, people punished, Aaron's excuses, Levites turn to Lord's side, 3,000 killed in camp, return to mountain, seeking forgiveness, plague, Moses's tent, meeting God's glory, cutting new tablets, God's covenant to do marvels, warning against alliances, commanding pilgrimages, Moses's face shining, and putting on veil. So as believers in Yeshua, I think it's important to study this week's Torah portion alongside 2 Corinthians chapter 3, which contrasts the glory of the old covenant given through Moses to the greater glory of the new covenant given to us through Yeshua Messiah. And so today I'm going to be comparing a couple of verses from Kitisa to some verses from 2 Corinthians chapter 3. So let's start by looking at Exodus 34, verses 29 through 30. It says, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant, and they were afraid to come near him. So after Moses' second 40-day stay on Mount Sinai, he returns to the Israelites positively glowing. He was literally lit up like a light bulb, and it was creeping people out. The chapter goes on to say in verses 33 and 33 through 35, it says, when Moses finished speaking to them, he put a veil over his face. But whenever he entered the Lord's presence to speak with him, he removed the veil until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites what he had been commanded, they saw that his face was radiant. Then Moses would put the veil back over his face until he went to speak with the Lord. So this verse says Moses wore a veil over his flashlight face for mood lighting. Just kidding. I believe Moses left himself unveiled around the Israelites only when speaking God's commands because the Jews were accustomed to experiencing God through signs and wonders, and Moses's radiance was visible proof that he had authority from God to give these holy commands. When Moses was just going about his business and talking about the weather, he didn't have to invoke the same fear of the Lord, so he covered up. 2 Corinthians 3:13 also gives insight on why Moses veiled himself. It says 3:13 says, we are not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away. So in context, this is speaking of the old law fading away, but it also serves as a reminder that Moses didn't have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, and so the radiance across his face would fade over time. Let's read 2 Corinthians 3, 7 through 8, which says, "Now if the ministry that brought death, which was engraved in letters on stone, came with glory, so that the Israelites could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of its glory, transitory though it was, will not the ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious?" This says the old covenant brought death, and that was glorious because it convicted us. It condemned us, rather. It revealed to us the error of our ways, how far we've fallen from God, and it instructed us on how to be right with God. We hadn't had that prior, so yes, we were evil, but we were ignorantly evil. The law exposed that ignorance, and for those with repentant hearts, that's glorious because we want to please God. But the new covenant brings life, and that's even more glorious because it's not about what we're doing, but what He's doing through us. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, "And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into His image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit." God cares more about who you are than what you do for Him. This final verse of 2 Corinthians chapter 3 says, "Who we are is determined by our spiritual maturity, and our spiritual maturity is built on the newer and better promises of the new covenant." As someone who studies the old covenant and has been blessed in the ways I've adopted it into my life, the greatest blessing I've found through the old covenant is how it is the perfect precursor for the new covenant. It all sets the stage for Yeshua. The old covenant exposes our sin, and the new covenant fulfills the promises of the old, thus enabling believers to be changed into the image of Messiah. Would we be able to recognize Yeshua's perfection without understanding our own flaws? For me, the more I learn about the old covenant, the more grateful I am for all the ways God has shown me mercy, and for the Holy Spirit who I can depend on so I don't have to depend on myself. My prayer today is we don't veil the glory of Christ radiating from our spirit. I love you all. Have a blessed day. Have a restful and peaceful Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom. See you next week.